Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to be back here. As Ann was going on, I mentioned to Jim that we're running a little behind schedule. And I said, Jim, I set myself up for 15 minutes here. Do you think I need to cut that short? And he said, 15 minutes is good. 10 to 15, that would be 7, 8, 10. So knowing that it's just me and lunch, I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. I do want to notice a couple of takeaways. I took a couple of notes that I just want to mention here. One of them is, first of all, a big thank you to Best NC for hosting this and foregrounding the principalship. I hope you take away one thing, actually several things today, but one of them is this. We in the field of education don't know of a more cost-effective lever to improve student learning, particularly in high-need schools, than putting the right principals in those schools. There just isn't anything that comes close. That's number one. Number two, we've seen a number of comments right away, beginning with Walter McDowell and then hearing from Steve Lassiter and Jeff Eisenhower and Eddie Price, that show us that really good principals can make a dramatic difference in student learning. We've known that for 35 years, that really good principals can make a profound difference in student learning. What we haven't figured out as a nation or any state is how to do this at scale. What does it take to produce those principals at scale? Because we know what it looks like in this school and that school and the other. I'm going to share with you today some of our efforts in Illinois and some of the progress that we've made at doing this at scale. Another takeaway is that we need to shift our thinking about who our client is in principal preparation programs. Up until now, for most states and most universities, our principal prep programs view the client as the graduate student that wants a credential. One of the messages from Ann Clark is that the client should be the kid in the public school. And nobody should be allowed to be admitted or graduated from these programs without our remembering that the client is the kid in the school who needs a good school leader, right? There are 3 times as many physicians in North Carolina as there are school principals. We could be 3 times as selective about who gets into principal preparation as we are about who gets into medical school. Finally, Ann asked more than once, what would it take for us to do this statewide? Why aren't we doing it statewide? And I'm going to say something that you might consider a little provocative, but I really think it's true. The major thing stopping North Carolina from being able to do what Ann Clark has done and Charlotte Mecklenburg, the major thing stopping the state from doing that at scale is probably the people in this room. If the leadership to go to scale in this state doesn't exist in this room, where would we look for it? In other words, the challenge of creating better leadership in schools, and we're demonstrating this in Chicago and in Illinois, the challenge to creating better leadership in schools is leadership at the state and the district and the university level. If we don't get the leadership from you folks, this isn't going to happen. Now for my formal remarks. It gets more fun than this. This is a recent study, just came out. The author of this study is coming out to Chicago shortly to talk with us about why Chicago is such an outlier in this distribution. This is Sean Reardon from Stanford. These are 3,000 American school districts. And the first thing they tell us is what we already know. And that is that the really high-performing districts are in the rich districts. Let me see if I've got a little pointer here, or if this thing will do it. Yeah. The really high-performing districts are the wealthier districts. Let's see, and I won't work on this. This doesn't take a pointer. If you go to the upper left on there, what you'll see is those are the highest income districts in the country. And these are the highest income districts that have a significant mix of African American and Latino and white kids at every grade. So these are 3,000 districts. So the first thing you notice is high-income districts have much higher student achievement than low-income districts. We already knew that. But the other thing that's worth noticing is that any given point on that particular distribution, any given income point that you want to move across, there's a 3 grade level difference in how the higher performing schools perform and the lower performing schools. You follow? If you take any socioeconomic point on that, It doesn't determine the learning outcomes of kids. There's a 3 grade level spread between how poor districts, the weaker districts do, and the stronger districts do. So to make that point with Charlotte-Mecklenburg, to tie it into what we just heard, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, in the upper right, is 4 grades above national averages in terms of student performance. And yet this is a school district with a median income that is, I can't see the figure there, maybe you can, it's far below our contrasting district, which is Simi Valley in California. That's the school district where the Ronald Reagan Library is. We picked on it simply because we were trying to show that even at higher income levels, there are lower performing districts. And even at lower income levels, there are higher performing districts. So the view that poverty determines school outcomes turns out to be a gross oversimplification. Does it influence it? Absolutely. But some districts are able to deal with low income much more effectively than other districts are, and it has to do with leadership at the top and leadership in each school. In 1987, under Ronald Reagan, the Secretary of Ed, William Bennett, came to Chicago and pronounced Chicago's public schools the worst school system in America. And I was teaching at that time. I was teaching at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and I remember that there was a big debate over whether Chicago was really the worst district in America, or maybe it was Detroit or Cleveland. That's not a discussion you want to be in. You know, are we the worst or third from the bottom, right? So at that time, we actually were third from the worst in the state of Illinois among all 55 of the largest districts in the state. I'll return to that in just a second. Look at what happened by 2015. One of the biggest critics of Chicago public schools is Crane's Chicago Business. Read that for yourself. Chicago started to be a national story at about that moment in elementary and in secondary school achievement. New York Times in 2017, there's no better place to see the difference that principals can make than Chicago. We've jacked up the college attendance and college completion rates. Younger children have made the biggest gains in the state in reading and math, larger than every other major city except Washington in the whole US. And in fact, if you look at the last 10 years, it's better than Washington, D.C. And this is the 3rd largest school district in the state, 90% minority kids, 85% low-income kids. Huffington Post came out shortly thereafter. I'll tell you in a minute why they wrote it. See what they said. What you see there is the district and higher ed working together in the partnership ways that Ann Clark described. The reason the HuffPost wrote this is they wanted to show quite often when you see a poor performing school or a poor performing district improve dramatically, people will say, well, of course it improved. It had nowhere to go but up. It was so bad, of course its gains were better. The truth is most poor performing schools stay low performing. Most low performing districts stay low. It is not easy to move these things. And so what that article did was to compare Chicago to Detroit, and Chicago's even worse than it was at the beginning of Detroit's even worse than it was at the beginning of No Child Left Behind, and Chicago, of course, is far better. This is too complicated to expect you to see everything, but it's a cool visual for the following reason. We looked at 15-year changes in math achievement, grades 3 through 8 in Illinois, ever since we started the new principal program in Chicago, the exact time period. And what you see is, if you look at the 55 largest districts in the state, the row below the state images there, it shows the median percent of students scoring at or above the state median. And what that shows you in the first state image is 19 districts lost significant ground, 15 points, versus the median of the state since No Child Left Behind in 2001. The next image says that another, 19 in the first one, and it looks like maybe 16 in the second one. 35 out of the 55 districts actually lost ground over the last 15 years. All right? You also see the bottom row, that first image, those 19 districts increased 21% in students in poverty, mostly white kids. The next image below that, you see an increase of 24% of students in poverty. With the recession that we saw beginning in '07, downstate students in poverty began to drive test scores statewide down. It used to be the narrative that brown and black kids in Chicago public schools were bringing down Illinois achievement. That's no longer true. The highest gaining district in the state of Illinois for the last 15 years has been Chicago. Only 4 districts actually substantially improved their test scores in the last 15 years, and Chicago was number 1 of those in math and in reading. This relates to the following notion from systems theory, and we saw this illustrated in Ann Clark's talk. Your system, any system, is perfectly designed to obtain the results you're obtaining. Unless something changes systemically in North Carolina, you will get the same results in this state next year that you're getting now, and you get the same results the year after. Ann Clark changed the outcomes in Charlotte-Mecklenburg by working with other universities and working with the district to change the system. And without those systemic changes, we don't see significant changes in the results. Second bullet is that principal prep and development are key elements of our current result system. And what I would say is they are the key elements, because these are the most cost-effective things that you can change to get the kind of dramatic results that we've been getting in Chicago. But to pull that off, you need state, district, and higher ed collaboration. Bonnie Fusarelli is doing a nationally recognized program at NC State. She can only do so much without the district and without the state. We've been able to showcase programs and showcase schools. The question Ann Clark raised is, why aren't we doing it statewide when we know it can be done and we know it's affordable? In fact, we costed out what it would be like for Illinois to do what we do in our program for every single principal in the state, every vacancy, and the Illinois Business Roundtable pronounced it a rounding error on the state education budget. It is not expensive to do this work. How does a principal really change student learning outcomes? Because a principal can't go in the class and teach. What you see on the far right is we're trying to improve student engagement and learning. This only happens at a significant level by changing quality of classroom instruction. You can move other chairs around the deck, but if you really want to improve the quality of student learning, particularly in lower income schools, the quality of classroom instruction has to improve. Al Shanker was right, you can't find high quality teachers, but what he overlooked was you can develop high quality teachers, and good principals don't just hire them, they develop them. And that takes you to that next box, which is organizational capacity. What does it mean for principals to develop the organizational capacity to do what Chuck said his company does, which is to get better every year? Well, that means, as he said, your staff has to be in a learning mode. Job number 1 for a great principal is teacher learning. If a great principal makes sure that those teachers are developing their instructional practice year after year, you cannot avoid student increases in their test scores and, more importantly, in their learning overall. But training principals to be able to develop teacher learning at scale that matters is not easy. It's time intensive. It can't be the old model of principal development that we used to have. My dad was a principal for most of his career, and as he likes to say, nobody ever expected me to improve student learning outcomes. Because the old model of the principal didn't do that. In the new model, we are holding principals accountable for that, and I would say, and we should. But that means we have to equip principals to actually rise to that challenge. That means they've got to understand how to build the organizational capacity of a school that will result in student engagement and learning. Administrative teams on the left. Here we heard from the private sector in the last session how important it is that teachers work in teams, that his staff work in teams. And so when he was asked, what would you do if you had 50 reports? The first thing that our principals do is they figure out what's the team structure going to be for this many teachers to work together to accomplish the fundamental goals of the school. What is school organizational capacity? There's actually a lot of good research done on this. The Consortium on Chicago School Research has been doing this longitudinal study for 25 years now. And what they've developed is the following. What they say is that, look, a school that gets even 3 of these 5 things right has a 10 times greater chance statistically than other schools to perform above socioeconomic status predictors. So let's focus on that for just a second. What this means is they studied those schools that have the same demographics of kids and found out some schools are here and some schools are here. So they spent over 20 years trying to study what's the difference in these schools. This study came out after 19 years, they're still studying it. Schools that have strong leadership, we've heard that over and over today, that develop the professional capacity of their staff, that have strong ties with parents and community, that are really holding students to a high academic standard and developing the teachers to do that, those schools get different results. So the question goes back to Ann Clark's question, why can't we do this at scale? Because we know how to do it. Why aren't we doing it at scale? The characteristics of the program that Bonnie is running and that now North Carolina has 6 more of these now operating tend to look like this. It's a results-oriented focus on principal impact on schools. The graduate student isn't our client. The student in the public school is our client. Partnerships with districts, and is one of the greatest examples of that in the country. Highly selected admission. Not everybody can do this work. Full-time, intensively coached site-based learning. At UIC, we have a 12-month paid internship for anybody that wants to be a principal coming out of our program. It's a small investment compared to what you get out of that. Integration of academic and practical learning, and post-licensure support. Once you get your license, you're not done learning as a principal. What kind of coaching, what kind of supports do you need to put in place? All of this is affordable. We're doing it at scale in Chicago because we have district and state support to do it. The challenge of improvement at scale just ain't that big. We have 400 vacancies in the state of Illinois for principals every year. That's half the size of my high school class. If we had the political will, we could do this in a minute. And in fact, the state of Illinois unanimously passed legislation to make this possible in every higher ed institution that offers principals. 250 in North Carolina would be a 10% turnover on an annual basis. Once you find that you strengthen the quality of the people going into the field, you find that your principal turnover rate starts to drop. The principal turnover rate is partly a function of the quality of the people who are going into the principal prep programs and being hired. You become intensively more selective about that and you get a big change. We are not yet organizing ourselves at scale to do this. And in fact, the last line is critical. To do it at scale almost certainly requires new leadership, activity in higher ed and in state leadership as well. This is not going to bubble up from districts by itself. It's going to take a concerted effort among those of you who have political will, political vision, and political power. States, in fact, can require district partnerships like Ann Clark put in place. In Illinois, we now require, you can't offer a principal program in Illinois as a university. We have 27 offering them in Illinois. You can't offer a principal prep program in Illinois unless you demonstrate that it is a partnership with a school district that participates in the design, implementation, and evaluation of the program. Why is this? Because higher ed has no skin in the game otherwise. Higher ed can be rewarded for turning out hundreds and hundreds of principals who, in fact, never even apply for principalship. There's money in it for us. The largest principal program in Illinois, actually third largest, when we passed this law in Illinois, had 1,700 people in its principal prep program for a state that has 400 vacancies a year. All right? Now, what were they doing? It was not preparing leaders for kids. They were raking in tuition, and they were the third largest. You know who the 2 largest were? They were both fully online programs. In most states in America today, Illinois is the only one I know that has stopped this. There may be others. You can get a principal certificate in your jammies. That's true in North Carolina. Now, how much do we care? Would you want that for medical doctors? Somehow we tolerate it for principals. These are the fastest growing programs in America. Who are the people that are going to do something about that? If they're outside this room, let's find out who they are. Limited number of partnerships can provide principals for the entire state. Ann talked about 20 to 25 a year. If each of the principal programs in Illinois produced only 20 a year, we would have more principals than we need by far, and we'd have a deep bench. That's what we're working toward. Not 1,700 per program, but 20, 25. The costs at scale are small by state budget standards. I want to show a couple of quick slides with a lot of text. This is for illustration purposes only. It took us about 10 years to pull off the legislative initiative on this. I led the state legislative task force. It took us time to do it. But the time you invest in, you should be able to do it faster than this because the whole national dialogue has progressed dramatically since 2006. I mean, in 2006, we were still in the old days where my dad said nobody expected me to raise student test scores or to improve student learning. We're past that now. It took us 10 years to get to the point where Illinois has been recognized by the University Council for Ed Admin, Wallace Foundation, and Education Commission of the States as having exemplary state policy for principal preparation development. We sunsetted every principal prep program in the state, even my own. I had to reapply and start from scratch. And I improved the program as a result. Key changes at the district level and the university level. 20 years ago, Chicago Public Schools did something that Ann referenced for Charlotte-Mecklenburg. It created its own bar exam and said a state certificate will not license you to be a principal in Chicago. Today, over 60% of state certificate holders that take the Chicago Principal Eligibility Exam fail it. Only 40% of state certificate holders pass. So right away, what Chicago's done is narrow the pool of people who are they're going to allow to lead their schools. At UIC and at New Leaders for New Schools, a not-for-profit organization, our pass rate is about 95%. You can make programs such that through selectivity and experiences, your folks will pass any bar. New Leaders in UIC in the last 15 years have placed over 300 principals in Chicago, and that's had a profound effect on Chicago public schools, as you can imagine, right? These are folks who are trained differently. This is next generation principal training. We now have, out of my tiny little program, we now have 150 graduates filling principal, AP, assistant principal, and district leadership roles, including the chief education officer of the district, and the head of early childhood for the district, and the head of language and culture for the district. In other words, people recognize the quality of these folks if they get the preparation that they need to get to become extraordinary performers. Here's the challenge to leadership at all levels. I'd like you to read that yourselves for a second. We know how to do this. We can afford it. My opening remark was it's highly likely that the only thing stopping North Carolina from getting there is the people in this room. Now, if I'm wrong about that, then we should find out who the right people are. We know how to do it. We can afford it. All right, thus concludeth my remarks.